The secure communication line crackled to life at 0347 hours Moscow time. General Dmitry Volkov's weathered hands trembled as he lifted the encrypted phone, knowing that what he was about to reveal would shake the foundations of Russian military command. The caller's voice was barely a whisper, but the words hit like artillery shells. Operation Thunderstorm has been compromised. They know everything. Volkov's blood ran cold. Operation Thunderstorm wasn't just any military campaign, it was Russia's most ambitious and secretive invasion plan, designed to reshape the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe in a matter of weeks. Years of preparation, billions of rubles invested, and the careers of the nation's top military brass all hung in the balance. But that was only the beginning of what would become the most catastrophic intelligence failure in modern Russian history. The plan had been conceived in the depths of winter, in a bunker buried beneath the Ural Mountains. President Vladimir Putin himself had given the green light, his steely gaze fixed on maps that showed projected Russian advances across 3 separate fronts. The operation was to be swift, decisive, and utterly devastating to enemy forces. NATO would be caught completely off guard, and by the time Western allies could mobilize a response, Russian forces would already be entrenched in positions that would take months to dislodge. But someone had been watching. Someone had been listening. And now, as dawn broke over Moscow, that someone was about to turn Russia's greatest military secret into its greatest nightmare. Colonel Alexei Petrov had always been considered one of Russia's most brilliant strategic minds. Graduated top of his class from the General Staff Academy, decorated veteran of 3 conflict zones, and trusted advisor to the highest levels of military command. What his superiors didn't know was that Petrov had been harboring doubts about the direction his country was heading for the past 2 years. The turning point had come during a classified briefing about civilian casualties from previous operations. The numbers were staggering, the images haunting. Petrov had gone home that night and stared at his sleeping daughter, wondering what kind of world he was helping to create for her future. That's when he made the decision that would ultimately save thousands of lives and prevent a catastrophic escalation of global conflict. Petrov had been methodically copying classified documents for 8 months. Not randomly, but with surgical precision. Every detail of Operation Thunderstorm found its way onto encrypted drives hidden in locations across Moscow. Supply routes, troop movements, ammunition depots, command structures, communication protocols, everything needed to understand and counter the invasion plan. But copying the intelligence was only half the battle. Getting it to the right people without being discovered required a level of tradecraft that would make career spies envious. Petrov had studied the masters of espionage, learning from historical cases of successful intelligence operations. He created multiple layers of security, using dead drops, coded messages, and a network of unwitting accomplices who never knew they were part of a larger operation. The breakthrough came when Petrov identified a weakness in the FSB's internal security protocols. A routine software update had created a temporary gap in their monitoring systems, a window that lasted exactly 14 minutes every Tuesday evening. It was during one of these windows that Petrov transmitted the complete Operation Thunderstorm files to a contact in the European intelligence community. No one expected what came next. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Within hours of receiving the intelligence, NATO forces began repositioning assets across Eastern Europe. Satellite imagery showed increased activity at military bases from Poland to Romania. Air patrols were intensified, and naval vessels took up strategic positions in the Baltic and Black Seas. Most critically, the element of surprise, the cornerstone of Operation Thunderstorm's success, had been completely eliminated. But the real chaos was just beginning inside the Kremlin itself. When intelligence reports confirmed that NATO was responding to information they shouldn't have possessed, a paranoia swept through Russian military leadership like wildfire. Emergency meetings were called at all hours. Polygraph tests were administered to personnel with access to classified materials. Counterintelligence teams launched investigations that would ultimately consume more resources than the original invasion plan. General Volkov found himself at the center of the storm. As one of the architects of Operation Thunderstorm, he was both hunter and hunted, tasked with finding the leak while simultaneously being investigated as a potential suspect. The irony wasn't lost on him that Russia's obsession with secrecy was now tearing apart the very institution it was meant to protect. The investigation quickly revealed the scope of the security breach. It wasn't just Operation Thunderstorm that had been compromised. The leaked documents included detailed assessments of Russian military capabilities, ammunition stockpiles, and logistical vulnerabilities that would take years to address. Foreign intelligence services now had a roadmap to Russian weaknesses that military planners had assumed would remain secret for decades. Meanwhile, Colonel Petrov maintained his cover with remarkable composure. He continued attending briefings, filing reports, and carrying out his duties as if nothing had changed. But inside, he was calculating his next moves. He knew that discovery was inevitable. The FSB's investigation was methodical and thorough. The question wasn't whether they would find him, but when, and what he could accomplish before that moment arrived. The pressure on Russia's military leadership became unbearable as reports of NATO preparations continued to pour in. President Putin demanded answers that nobody could provide. How had such sensitive information been compromised? Who was responsible? And most importantly, how could Operation Thunderstorm proceed when the enemy knew their every move? Defense Minister Sergei Kozlov found himself in an impossible position. He had staked his career on Operation Thunderstorm's success, personally assuring Putin that the plan was foolproof. Now, with the entire operation exposed, he faced the prospect of career destruction and possible criminal charges for the intelligence failure that had occurred under his watch. The decision to cancel Operation Thunderstorm came during a tense meeting in Putin's private office. The room was filled with the country's top military officials, intelligence chiefs, and senior advisors. Maps covered the walls, showing the original invasion routes that would now have to be abandoned. The atmosphere was thick with recrimination and fear. The operation is compromised beyond recovery, admitted General Volkov, his voice barely concealing his frustration. NATO forces are positioned to counter every aspect of our planned advance. Proceeding now would result in catastrophic losses with minimal strategic gain. Putin's reaction was controlled but unmistakably furious. Years of planning, enormous financial investment, and Russia's military reputation all hung in the balance. The cancellation of Operation Thunderstorm would send shockwaves through the military establishment and potentially weaken Russia's position in future negotiations with Western powers. But the alternative was even worse. Intelligence assessments showed that NATO's countermeasures were so comprehensive that Operation Thunderstorm had transformed from a swift victory into a potential military disaster. Russian forces would face prepared enemies, established defensive positions, and coordinated international resistance that could result in unprecedented casualties. The hunt for the source of the leak intensified after the operation's cancellation. FSB investigators employed increasingly sophisticated techniques to trace the intelligence breach. They analyzed metadata from classified documents, conducted surveillance on personnel with access to sensitive materials, and used psychological pressure tactics to identify potential suspects. Colonel Petrov knew his time was running out. The investigation was closing in, and soon they would identify the patterns that pointed directly to him. But he had one final card to play, information that would ensure his actions had lasting impact beyond just stopping one military operation. Hidden among his copied files were documents revealing a network of corruption within the military procurement system. Billions of rubles had been diverted from legitimate military purposes into private accounts controlled by senior officials. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, naming names and providing financial records that would be impossible to dismiss or cover up. The revelation of this corruption network would ultimately prove more damaging to Russian military capability than the failure of Operation Thunderstorm itself. The scandal reached the highest levels of military leadership, resulting in mass resignations, criminal investigations, and a complete restructuring of defense procurement processes that would take years to complete. 3 weeks after Operation Thunderstorm's cancellation, FSB agents arrived at Colonel Petrov's apartment at dawn. They found him calmly drinking coffee and reading military journals, as if he had been expecting them. His arrest was conducted without incident, but the damage he had inflicted on Russian military operations was irreversible. During his interrogation, Petrov showed no remorse for his actions. When asked why he had betrayed his country, his response was simple but profound: "I didn't betray my country. I saved it from a catastrophic mistake that would have cost thousands of lives and achieved nothing but international condemnation." The trial was conducted in secret, but word of Petrov's motivations spread throughout the military community. Some viewed him as a traitor who had weakened Russia's position on the global stage. Others saw him as a patriot who had prevented a military disaster that would have damaged Russian interests far more than the intelligence leak itself. The international implications of Operation Thunderstorm's failure extended far beyond military considerations. NATO unity was strengthened by the shared intelligence and coordinated response to the Russian threat. European nations increased defense spending and accelerated military modernization programs. The United States reinforced its commitment to Eastern European allies with additional troops and advanced weapons systems. But perhaps the most significant impact was within Russia itself. The failure exposed deep problems within the military establishment that went far beyond a single intelligence breach. Corruption, incompetence, and institutional weaknesses that had been hidden behind a facade of military strength were now impossible to ignore. General Volkov found himself in an unexpected position following the investigation's conclusion. Rather than being scapegoated for the intelligence failure, he was tasked with leading comprehensive military reforms designed to prevent similar catastrophes in the future. The irony wasn't lost on him that the failure of Operation Thunderstorm had ultimately created opportunities for positive change that might not have existed otherwise. The reforms that followed were extensive and painful. Security protocols were completely overhauled, with new systems designed to detect and prevent insider threats. Personnel screening processes were enhanced, and ongoing monitoring of individuals with access to classified materials became more sophisticated and comprehensive. But the changes went deeper than just security measures. The corruption exposed by Petrov's leaked documents forced a fundamental re-evaluation of how Russia's military operated. Procurement processes were reformed, financial oversight was strengthened, and accountability measures were implemented at every level of command. Years later, military historians would debate whether Colonel Petrov's actions strengthened or weakened Russian security. Those who viewed him as a traitor pointed to the intelligence advantage his leak provided to NATO forces and the damage to Russia's international reputation. His supporters argued that preventing Operation Thunderstorm's catastrophic failure and exposing military corruption ultimately made Russia's armed forces more effective and legitimate. The truth, as often happens in matters of national security, was more complex than either side wanted to admit. Petrov's actions had prevented a military disaster while simultaneously exposing systemic problems that needed to be addressed. The short-term damage to Russian military capabilities was offset by long-term improvements in institutional effectiveness and integrity. The legacy of Operation Thunderstorm's failure continued to influence Russian military planning for years afterward. Future operations were subjected to more rigorous security reviews, with multiple layers of oversight designed to prevent similar intelligence breaches. The paranoia that had initially consumed military leadership evolved into a more mature understanding of security challenges in an interconnected world. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the power of individual conscience in preventing catastrophic mistakes. Colonel Petrov's decision to leak classified information wasn't made lightly or without understanding the potential consequences. He had weighed the risks to his career, his freedom, and his family against the potential costs of allowing Operation Thunderstorm to proceed. The moral complexity of his choice reflected broader questions about loyalty, duty, and the responsibility of military professionals to prevent actions they believe would harm their country's long-term interests. These questions had no easy answers, but they forced important conversations about the balance between following orders and exercising independent judgment. As news of the failed operation spread through international intelligence communities, it became clear that the implications extended far beyond Russia's borders. The comprehensive nature of the leaked intelligence provided unprecedented insights into Russian military doctrine, capabilities, and decision-making processes that would influence Western defense planning for decades. NATO analysts spent months studying the Operation Thunderstorm documents, extracting lessons about Russian strategic thinking and operational capabilities. This intelligence windfall allowed Western military planners to develop more effective countermeasures and defensive strategies, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The psychological impact on Russian military leadership was perhaps even more significant than the strategic implications. The knowledge that their most sensitive plans could be compromised by insider threats created a climate of suspicion and mistrust that hampered effective decision-making. Officers became reluctant to share information, even within secure channels, leading to coordination problems that would plague military operations for years. Colonel Petrov served his sentence in a minimum security facility, where he spent his time writing detailed analyses of military reform proposals. Even from prison, his intellectual contributions to strategic thinking continued to influence debates about Russian military modernization. His case became a subject of study in military academies around the world, examined as both a cautionary tale about insider threats and an example of principled resistance to questionable orders. The broader implications of Operation Thunderstorm's failure resonated throughout Russian society. The revelation that such an ambitious military operation had been planned and then abandoned raised questions about the decision-making processes within the highest levels of government. Citizens began to ask more pointed questions about military spending, strategic priorities, and the accountability of military leadership. International relations experts noted that the failed operation marked a turning point in post-Cold War European security dynamics. The comprehensive intelligence sharing between NATO allies that had enabled the coordinated response to Operation Thunderstorm demonstrated a level of alliance cooperation that hadn't been seen since the height of the Cold War. But the story's most enduring legacy may be its demonstration of how individual actions can have far-reaching historical consequences. Colonel Petrov's decision to leak classified documents prevented what military analysts later concluded would have been a catastrophic military failure that could have destabilized the entire European continent. The final chapter of this saga unfolded years later, when previously classified documents revealed the true scope of what Operation Thunderstorm had been intended to accomplish. The invasion plan was far more ambitious than even the leaked documents had indicated, with objectives that would have required sustained military operations across multiple fronts for months or even years. Analysis of the complete operation plans showed that Russia's military leadership had dramatically underestimated both the challenges they would face and the international response their actions would provoke. The failure to launch Operation Thunderstorm may have prevented not just a military disaster, but a broader conflict that could have drawn in multiple nations and resulted in casualties on a scale not seen since World War II. Today, the case of Operation Thunderstorm stands as a stark reminder of how intelligence failures can cascade into strategic catastrophes, and how individual courage can sometimes prevent disasters that would affect millions of people. The documents that Colonel Petrov leaked continue to be studied by military strategists, intelligence professionals, and policy makers seeking to understand the complex dynamics of modern warfare and international security. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Russia. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.